"Grandpa, my parents are going to take your money tonight." The whisper from 8-year-old Sophie was a dagger in the quiet, a betrayal no man should ever hear from the lips of his own blood. His heart slammed against his ribs, the room spinning as he forced a weary smile to hide the storm boiling inside him. Years of sacrifice, of paying their bills, of saving their home, and this was his reward. Viewers, imagine discovering your son's greed through the innocent voice of a child. Don't miss what he does next. Subscribe now because the real story is only beginning. The phone rattled on the kitchen counter just after sunrise, slicing through the stillness of a Saturday morning. He reached for it, expecting perhaps a wrong number or some neighbor with an emergency. Instead, it was Michael. His son's voice carried that jittery tremor that never quite left him, the same one that surfaced years ago when he dented the family truck as a teenager and tried to explain it away. "Dad, I know it's early, but you're coming to Sophie's birthday, right? You really need to be there. Rachel wanted me to make sure you'd come." The old man froze in his chair, coffee halfway to his lips, watching the morning light spill across the newspaper he hadn't touched since yesterday. Sophie's birthday had always been a given. He'd never missed one, not even the years when work swallowed him whole or when his wife lay sick in the hospital. Why the sudden urgency? Why the rehearsed insistence? His instincts sharpened, those same instincts that once closed million-dollar deals in conference rooms where one wrong glance meant being devoured. Something was off. Michael stammered on, filling silence with too many words. "The party starts at 2, but maybe you could come a little early. Rachel thinks it'd be good to talk. About family things. Future stuff, you know." Family things. Future stuff. The father set his cup down, his hand steady though his stomach coiled. Never in all the years of birthdays and barbecues had they needed special talks wrapped around celebrations. His business mind, though softened by age, clicked into gear. When people started using vague phrases about the future, it usually meant they were circling your assets like vultures waiting for a carcass to fall still. He kept his voice measured calm. "Of course I'll be there, Michael. I wouldn't miss Sophie's day." There was a pause on the other end, then a nervous laugh. "Great. And Dad, just keep an open mind, okay? We just want everyone to be taken care of." The line went dead before he could press for details. He sat staring at the silent phone, the room suddenly heavier. Taken care of. He knew enough about the world to understand that phrase usually meant someone else was about to get very comfortable at his expense. He rose from the table, walked to the window, and watched his neighbor across the street watering flower boxes as if the world hadn't just tilted sideways. His reflection in the glass looked older than he felt inside, lines deepened by grief, hair thinner than he cared to admit. He thought of Ellen, his wife gone 3 years now, who would have cut through Michael's nervous chatter with a single sharp glance. She'd always been the one to see through Rachel's polite smiles and perfectly timed thank yous. Upstairs in his bedroom, he stared at the row of shirts still carrying faint scents of his wife's perfume, remnants of a life that felt more like a dream with every passing day. He chose a blue one, the same shade he'd worn to her funeral, and for a moment he almost heard Rachel's hushed comment that day. "So much space in this house, Norman. You could downsize, you know." Even then it had felt like an appraisal more than a concern. His mind drifted to the running tally he carried in silence, over $70,000, funneled into Michael and Rachel's emergencies. Mortgage payments that never seemed to catch up, car repairs that ballooned into engine rebuilds, private school tuition bills for Sophie because they wanted her in the right environment. At the time, he told himself it was what fathers did, step in when life pressed too hard. But now, with Sophie's whisper lingering in his ears and Michael's uneasy phone call still vibrating through his chest, he saw the pattern. Every request had been preparation conditioning him to say yes, to open his wallet wider, to make sacrifice a reflex. He grabbed his keys from the counter, pausing at the refrigerator. Sophie's crayon drawing was pinned beneath a magnet shaped like a lighthouse. A crooked house stick figures labeled Grandpa, Daddy, Mommy, and Me. Purple marker spelled out, "Best day ever." He traced the little letters with his finger, heart tightening. That little girl was the only honest soul left in the house he was about to walk into. At the mall, he moved through the crowds like a man drifting in two worlds. On the surface, he was a doting grandfather picking out gifts, a Lego Statue of Liberty set for $180, a new bicycle with reflective strips for $320, even a bouquet of white roses for Rachel, because gestures, however empty, maintained the illusion of family. But beneath the purchases ran a current of suspicion, cold and relentless. He couldn't shake the image of Michael and Rachel at the bank with a pile of papers, as a neighbor casually mentioned. He told himself it was nothing, routine business maybe, but his gut knew better. He'd spent 40 years in construction learning how to read foundations before a single brick was laid. Cracks revealed themselves long before walls came crashing down. And this morning, in every tremor of Michael's voice and every forced smile, he saw the cracks widening. By the time he loaded the gifts into the back of his SUV, nearly $600 spent on tokens of love, the decision had already been made. He would go. He would smile. He would watch every glance, measure every word, and wait for the moment when truth revealed itself. For Sophie's sake, he would play the part of the trusting old man. But in his heart, he was already drawing up blueprints of defense sketches of revenge. Driving home through the late morning traffic, his jaw tightened. The betrayal hadn't yet unfolded, but he could feel it pressing against the horizon like a storm. He imagined Rachel's bright artificial smile. He imagined Michael's practiced speeches about family and future. He imagined Sophie's small, worried eyes looking to him for protection. When he reached his driveway, he sat for a moment in silence. The house loomed behind him, every brick a memory of a life built with his wife's steady hand. He thought of the promise he made her before she died. Take care of Sophie, but watch Michael carefully. At the time, he assumed she meant keeping him away from bad influences, cheap friends, bad investments. Now he realized she'd seen something deeper. Something he had refused to acknowledge, a weakness that could be twisted by someone like Rachel. He carried the gifts inside, lined them neatly by the door, and looked once more at Sophie's drawing. A crooked little house, a purple scrawl of love. He touched the paper gently, then straightened, a cold calm settling over him. Whatever awaited at that party, he would be ready. The clock ticked toward afternoon. Soon he would step into their house, hear the music and laughter, see the decorations strung like camouflage. Soon he would see Rachel's eyes flicker with calculation. Michael's voice rise with forced enthusiasm. Sophie's smile dim with the weight of secrets no child should carry. He poured one last cup of coffee, the steam curling like ghosts from the past, and let the bitterness settle on his tongue. Somewhere inside, anger was coiling steady and controlled. He had been generous, he had been trusting. But tonight, when the curtain fell and the mask slipped, they would all learn who they were really dealing with. The road to that house would be short, only a few miles, but it would take him from the familiar comfort of his home into enemy territory, disguised as family celebration. And deep down he knew this birthday party would be remembered not for balloons or cake, but for the moment betrayal met its reckoning. The numbers haunted him more than any nightmare could. $70,000. That was the total he had poured into his son's life over the past 3 years, dressed up as family emergencies. He could trace every dollar if he wanted the mortgage payments that were always just one step from disaster, the endless car repairs that swallowed thousands, as if the vehicles were built to fail, the tuition bills for Sophie's private school that arrived like clockwork, heavy with expectation. At the time, each payment felt like a duty, a father's obligation to steady his son when life pressed too hard. But now, with Sophie's frightened whisper still echoing in his ears and Michael's nervous phone call replaying in his mind, the old man felt those payments shift into something else entirely: evidence. His wife had warned him. Ellen's voice came back with chilling clarity, a memory sharpened by hindsight. She had said Michael was weak, too easily swayed by anyone strong enough to pull his strings. At the time, he had dismissed her worry as a mother's protectiveness, a sharp tongue softened by love. But Ellen had always been right about people. She read motives like other people read recipes, with precision and little patience for embellishment. If she saw weakness in Michael, then perhaps she had also seen the danger standing beside him, Rachel, with her polished smile and her eyes that lingered too long on things that weren't hers. He thought back to the day of Ellen's funeral when Rachel leaned close, her voice pitched low as mourners whispered prayers. "So much space in this house, Norman. Don't you think it's too much for one man?" The words had carried a false sweetness, but even then he'd felt the undertone, a calculated suggestion disguised as concern. He had brushed it off in his grief, but now stacked against the weight of Sophie's warning, it felt like the first brick in a wall of betrayal being built around him. He walked through his home as if seeing it for the first time. Every room carried Ellen's touch. The granite countertops she insisted on, the oak dining table scarred with decades of meals, the rose garden out back she had tended with bare hands until they bled. This was the life they had built together, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. And now he realized his son and daughter-in-law weren't circling like family, they were circling like predators. They had tested him with small requests, then larger ones, training him to say yes, pushing the limits until the idea of writing another check became as natural as breathing. They had mistaken generosity for weakness. The father stopped in front of the safe tucked behind Ellen's portrait in his study. His hand hovered over the frame, memories threatening to break the calm mask he forced over his face. He hadn't opened that safe in months, maybe longer. Inside was the record of his life's work deeds, investment papers, bank statements, evidence of everything he had built from the ground up. He spun the dial slowly, the numbers of Ellen's birthday clicking under his fingers, and pulled the door open. The weight of the steel matched the weight in his chest. Stacks of documents sat neatly inside, organized with the precision of a man who had spent 4 decades running a construction business. Mortgage deeds for rental properties Michael didn't even know existed. Investment portfolios worth far more than his son could imagine. Bank statements methodically filed showing the slow bleed of his generosity, every payment marked family support, every loan forgiven. He pulled out a thick folder and spread the papers across his desk, studying them with the cold detachment of a man inspecting blueprints. Patterns leapt out at him now that grief no longer clouded his judgment. The frequency of requests, the escalation of amounts, the timing of Rachel's suggestions about assisted living. None of it was random. It was a conditioning plan executed with the patience of people who believed their prey was too trusting to fight back. He leaned back in his chair, staring at Ellen's photograph on the bookshelf. Her eyes, caught in that frozen smile, seemed to ask if he was finally seeing what she had warned him about. He whispered into the empty room, "You were right. He's weak, and she knows it." The thought festered as the afternoon stretched on. He pictured Michael's nervous grin, Rachel's polite laughter, Sophie's forced smile at her own party. He knew now the birthday celebration was a stage, the decorations and laughter nothing more than camouflage. They would wait until the guests were gone, then reveal the real reason for his presence. Documents from the bank, legal papers dressed up as guardianship or power of attorney. A trap disguised as help. But he was not the man they thought he was. He was not some frail old fool waiting to be led by the hand into an assisted living facility. He was a builder, a negotiator, a man who had carved a business out of sweat and risk when no one believed in him. He had survived recessions, betrayals, and backroom deals that would have crushed lesser men. And now his own son thought he could strip him of his life's work with a signature on a piece of paper. He pulled a yellow legal pad from his drawer and began to write. Names, dates, amounts. Every payment made to Michael and Rachel over the past 3 years down to the last cent. The numbers filled line after line, a ledger of sacrifice now weaponized into a record of betrayal. As his pen scratched across the paper, his resolve hardened. They would not see weakness when they looked at him. They would see a man who had been preparing his whole life for moments like this. By the time he set the pen down, the sun was bleeding into the horizon. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that comes just before a storm. He stood, straightened his shirt, and walked to the window. In the distance, the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the driveway. Tomorrow he would drive to Michael's house with Sophie's gifts in the back seat and a smile carved carefully onto his face. He would step into that staged party, accept their hugs, play his role as the doting father and grandfather. But behind his eyes, he would be measuring every move, every glance, every word. Because now he knew. Ellen had been right. Michael was weak, and Rachel was already counting his money as if it were hers. The father's jaw tightened, his hand closing into a fist at his side. Let them think he was blind. Let them think his trust was theirs to plunder. They had no idea they were walking into the fight of their lives. And as he turned away from the window, one thought settled over him. With the finality of a gavel strike, tomorrow would not end the way they expected. The encounter seemed harmless enough at first. He had just finished loading Sophie's new bicycle into the back of his SUV when he heard his name called. Turning, he saw his longtime neighbor strolling across the parking lot, her silver hair pinned neatly, a bookstore bag swinging at her side. She greeted him with the warmth of old familiarity, the kind that comes from 15 years of sharing holiday cookies and summer lawn work. They exchanged pleasantries. Then she mentioned it casually, like she was noting the weather. I saw Michael and Rachel downtown earlier this week, leaving First National with a stack of papers. Looked important. Refinancing, I suppose. The father's smile didn't falter, but something inside him tightened. It was the kind of detail most people would brush off, but for a man who had spent his career reading the smallest tells across conference tables, it was a warning flare. Bank documents. Timing that aligned perfectly with Michael's nervous phone call. He kept his tone light, nodding at her explanation. Probably routine business, he said, though. His pulse quickened. She patted his arm kindly, wished Sophie a happy birthday, and walked away. He stood by his car, watching her disappear into the crowd, while unease spread through him like a fracture running through glass. He slid into the driver's seat, the leather creaking under his weight, and stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The eyes staring back were steady but darkened by suspicion. Documents from the bank. A sudden need for a private conversation. Rachel's new wave of enthusiasm about him attending the party. It was all beginning to line up the edges of a puzzle he hadn't wanted to assemble. He started the engine, but the hum of the German motor did nothing to soothe the storm building inside. Driving home, he forced himself to replay every interaction of the past few months. Rachel's comment about his house being too large, Michael's repeated assurances that they'd pay him back soon. The way Rachel's eyes gleamed whenever she stepped into his kitchen, scanning the countertops like a buyer evaluating real estate. He thought of the roses sitting on the passenger seat, bought not out of affection but strategy, a peace offering to soften her edges. He wondered if she already pictured herself arranging flowers there permanently. The city rolled past in muted colors, a blur of storefronts and stoplights, but his mind was locked on darker images. Legal papers with his name printed in bold. Signatures drawn out of him under the guise of help. The word guardianship floated unbidden into his mind, chilling him more than the cool air spilling from the vents. He had heard of families torn apart that way, and aging parents stripped of authority by children who claimed it was for their protection. He never imagined his own son would stand in that line, but now he wasn't so sure. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the unease had grown into something sharper. He carried the gifts inside, setting the bicycle box carefully against the wall, the Lego set on the table, the roses in a glass vase. For a moment he simply stood in his living room, listening to the silence. Ellen's absence was always there, but tonight it pressed heavier than usual, as if her voice lingered just beyond reach, urging him to see the truth before it swallowed him whole. He could almost hear her, watch him carefully. He walked into his study and sat behind the heavy oak desk that had carried the weight of contracts, blueprints, and negotiations for decades. He opened a drawer and pulled out a fresh notepad. His pen scratched across the page as he wrote down everything he knew: the $70,000 given over 3 years, the car repairs, the tuition, the mortgage payments. He added today's detail, the bank visit, with a stack of documents. A timeline took shape before him, stark and undeniable. It no longer looked like scattered acts of generosity. It looked like a strategy. The father leaned back, tapping the pen against the desk, his jaw tightening. He imagined Rachel standing in some banker's office, smiling that polite smile while papers slid across the desk. He imagined Michael shifting uncomfortably beside her, his shame outweighed by her determination. He pictured signatures being placed on lines that would carve away his independence, reduce him from patriarch to ward. The image burned hot in his chest, but he let the anger cool into something steadier. Anger clouded judgment. He needed clarity. He rose and crossed the room to the safe behind Ellen's portrait. The dial turned under his fingers, smooth with years of use, and the heavy door clicked open. Inside, the truth waited. He pulled out his financial records, spread them across the desk, and studied them like a man preparing for trial. He traced the pattern of withdrawals, the steady slope of generosity turning into exploitation. He noted the untouched investments, the rental properties hidden from casual knowledge, the assets they couldn't possibly know about. He realized then that Rachel and Michael weren't circling a carcass, they were circling a fortress. They thought he was vulnerable. They thought wrong. Hours passed unnoticed as the old man sat beneath the dim light, the papers around him like evidence in a courtroom. Outside, the neighborhood settled into night porch lights glowing against the dark. He barely noticed. He was building something else, something invisible, a plan. He would not confront them outright, not yet. That would give them ground to retreat, time to craft excuses. No. He would play his part at the party, smile at the guests, toast his granddaughter. And when the moment came when Michael and Rachel thought they had him cornered, he would be ready. He gathered the papers, slid them back into the safe, and locked it tight. Then he returned to the notepad and wrote one final line beneath the ledger of betrayals. They will not see it coming. Rising from the desk, he walked to the window and looked out at the darkened street. Across the way, porch lights flickered. Families settled in front of televisions. Children prepared for bed. It was an ordinary night for them, but not for him. For him, the night carried the weight of revelation. Tomorrow he would walk into Michael's house, not as the trusting old man they thought they could manipulate, but as the builder he had always been. And builders understood foundations, how to strengthen them, and how to bring them crashing down. He turned off the light, leaving the study in shadow, and climbed the stairs slowly, deliberately. Sleep would not come easy, but that was fine. He no longer needed rest. He needed resolve. And resolve, unlike trust, was something Michael and Rachel could never take from him. Tomorrow would come. Tomorrow the party would unfold with laughter and cake. Tomorrow masks would slip and intentions would reveal themselves. And tomorrow, in the house filled with balloons and streamers, someone would walk away shattered. It would not be him. The driveway was already packed with cars when he arrived, the sound of children's laughter floating through the open windows before he even reached the front steps. He balanced the oversized gift bags in his arms and knocked lightly, though the door swung open almost immediately. Rachel greeted him with an enthusiasm that felt painted on her arms, spread wide as if they were actors rehearsing a reunion scene. "You look wonderful today," she gushed, her hand lingering on his sleeve just a moment too long. He studied her face, noting the brightness in her eyes that seemed less like warmth and more like calculation. Inside, the house looked transformed. Streamers looped from ceiling to ceiling, clusters of balloons weighed down corners, and tables sagged beneath trays of food. It was more elaborate than any of Sophie's past birthdays, so polished it felt staged, as though someone had decided this year the family would perform for an audience. He carried the bicycle box into the living room, where voices rose in forced cheer, and Michael appeared like a salesman stepping onto the floor. "There he is, my amazing father!" Michael declared too loudly, clapping him on the back with a flourish that drew glances from nearby guests. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The father recognized the tone, the exaggerated praise. It was theater, not affection. Michael introduced him to a co-worker, rambling about his father's wisdom in business, his lessons on loyalty and trust. The words sounded rehearsed, each line sliding out like something memorized in front of a mirror. He nodded politely, but inside he measured the performance. It was as if they had written a script, each scene carefully blocking where he should stand, what he should hear, and how he should be seen by others. Rachel floated around him like a hostess in a glossy magazine, refilling his glass before it emptied, asking about his comfort, laughing too quickly at every word he spoke. She set a plate of canapes in front of him and leaned in close, her perfume strong, her voice soft. "I made these especially for you." He forced a smile and picked one up, though the gesture left a bitter taste long before the food reached his lips. Across the room, Sophie spotted him. Her small figure cut through the crowd like sunlight through storm clouds, and she barreled into him with arms outstretched. He knelt to catch her, holding her tight as her cheek pressed against his chest. For a moment the noise, the false cheer, the careful staging, all of it fell away. Her hug was real, and so were her eyes when she pulled back to look at him. Wide, worried, far too heavy for an 8-year-old on her birthday. She whispered a soft thank you for her gift, but her voice trembled at the edges. He stroked her hair, forcing his face into the mask of a doting grandfather, though inside his chest the storm gathered strength. When she pulled away, Rachel swooped in, nudging her daughter toward the gift table, with a reminder to say thank you properly. Sophie obeyed, her voice thinner this time, her eyes flicking back at him as if to say the real words she couldn't. He understood. That hug had carried more truth than anything else in the house. As the afternoon unfolded, the choreography of deception became clearer. Michael steered conversations with precision, deflecting any mention of money, retirement, or property. If a guest spoke about mortgages or the economy, he quickly shifted to stories of Sophie's softball games or neighborhood events. Rachel hovered at his side, her timing so perfect it seemed rehearsed, always ready with a smile, a laugh, or a subject change. Together they managed the flow of information like stage directors guarding their production. The father sat quietly playing his part. He laughed when expected, complimented the decorations, admired the cake. He let them believe he was lulled by the spectacle, but inside every detail sharpened into a pattern. Michael's constant glances at his watch, Rachel's small gestures of reassurance, their quick eye contact across the room. These weren't the habits of a happy couple hosting a child's birthday. They were signals-coded communication meant to keep their performance aligned. He caught Sophie watching him from the corner of the room, her small hands fidgeting with the ribbon of a gift bag. When their eyes met, she gave a half-smile, brave but fragile, as if she carried a secret too heavy for her young shoulders. His chest ached. Ellen's face flashed in his mind, her warning clear. Watch Michael carefully. He wondered if she had seen this future taking shape even as illness closed in on her. He wished she were here now, her sharp intuition slicing through the pretense surrounding him. By late afternoon, the party hit its peak. Music spilled from speakers, children darted between clusters of adults, and laughter rang out louder than before. But for him, every sound echoed hollow. It was the sound of actors straining to convince themselves the show was real. He moved through the rooms with steady grace, his glass in hand, his smile measured. Inside, his thoughts churned like gears, cataloging each glance and gesture, filing them away for later. As the sun dipped lower, guests began collecting their coats, offering goodbyes and thanking Rachel for her hospitality. Michael's laugh grew sharper, more forced as the crowd thinned. His son's eyes darted toward him, more often urgency leaking through the mask. Rachel approached once more, touching his arm with practiced concern. "Don't leave just yet," she said lightly. "We've all been looking forward to a little family talk." He met her gaze, nodding slowly, his face the picture of calm acceptance. Inside, his mind was already preparing for the moment the stage lights would dim and the real performance would begin. Tomorrow everyone else would remember balloons and cake. But for him, this birthday would mark something very different. And as he looked once more at Sophie clutching her new Lego set while trying to hide the fear in her eyes, he knew the truth was coming. The party was nothing but a curtain, and behind it waited the betrayal they thought he could not see. The party noise dimmed as he stepped into the narrow hallway lined with framed photographs meant to project the image of a happy family. He moved slowly, pretending to look at the pictures, but really searching for a breath away from the staged laughter behind him. That was when he felt the tug. Small fingers pinched the fabric of his jacket. He turned, and there was Sophie, her eyes wide, her face pale under the pastel glow of the streamers. She glanced back toward the living room before leaning closer, her voice barely a whisper. "They plan to take your money tonight, Grandpa." The words landed heavier than any blow. For a heartbeat he thought he had misheard, that perhaps she was recounting some childish fear. But her trembling lips pressed on. "I heard them talking last night. Mom said you have too much money for an old man living alone. She said tonight they're going to fix it." Dad looked scared, but Mom told him the papers from the bank would make everything legal. The hallway tilted around him. He placed a hand on the wall, steadying himself as the chandelier light flickered through the doorframe. He forced his breathing slow, his face calm, though inside his chest his heart pounded against bone. No child should carry a secret like this. Yet here she was, Sophie clutching his sleeve with the desperate grip of someone who understood more than she should. He crouched to meet her at eye level. Her chin quivered, her eyes glassy. "What exactly did you hear, sweetheart?" His voice was steady, but beneath the surface ran a current of dread. She bit her lip, a gesture that reminded him painfully of Ellen during tense moments. Dad kept saying, "What if he finds out?" And Mom said it would be too late by then. "Grandpa, I don't want them to take your money. You're the only one who really listens to me." He felt her small body shudder when he pulled her into his arms. The betrayal cut deeper, knowing they had plotted so carelessly, whispering their schemes within earshot of their daughter. He could smell the faint trace of birthday cake frosting on Sophie's hair. Innocence tangled with a burden far too heavy for her age. "Listen to me carefully," he whispered back. "You did the right thing telling me, but this has to stay our secret for now. Can you do that?" She nodded against his shoulder, though a tear slipped down her cheek. She pulled back just enough to ask the question that broke him. "Will you still love me if Mom and Dad get mad?" The word stabbed like a knife twisted slow. He cupped her face in his hands, making sure she saw the certainty in his eyes. "Nothing they do could ever change how much I love you. Nothing." Relief flickered across her features, the first genuine smile he had seen from her all day. The voices from the living room swelled as a toast rang out, muffled laughter spilling through the swinging kitchen door. He stood taking Sophie's hand. Together they walked back toward the performance, but everything had changed. Every balloon, every decoration, every too bright smile now looked like stage dressing, hiding something rotten underneath. He settled back into the couch, listening with sharpened ears. Michael's laughter was too loud, Rachel's attentiveness too precise. He saw now the choreography Sophie had exposed, the constant watch-checking, the subtle nods, the urgent whispers disguised as marital exchanges. They weren't simply hosting a party, they were preparing for an execution, one signed with ink rather than blood. He played his part. He accepted another glass of wine, complimented the decorations, nodded at Rachel's attempts at charm. But inside he shifted. He was no longer the passive patriarch being managed and guided. He was a hunter masking his stance, watching the trap tighten around him, while planning how to spring it back on those who had set it. As the cake was cut and candles blown out, he kept Sophie close by, her laughter louder now, though only he knew it was courage, not joy. He studied Michael across the table, seeing not the boy he once taught to fish, but a man cornered by his wife's ambition, his shame wrapped in desperation. He looked at Rachel, her smile razor-thin, her hands smoothing every wrinkle of the performance, determined to keep the illusion intact until signatures could make the theft real. When the last guests began to drift out, coats pulled from hooks, polite goodbyes exchanged, Michael caught his father's arm. "Dad, stick around after everyone leaves. We need to talk about those family matters we mentioned." The words were casual, but the tension in his son's jaw betrayed the urgency. Rachel appeared instantly, her hand brushing his sleeve with feigned concern. "Yes, Norman, it won't take long. Just a quick discussion. We've been planning this for weeks." He smiled thinly, feigning fatigue, pressing a hand to his temple. "Perhaps tomorrow. This headache isn't letting up." Their eyes flashed with alarm. Michael's hand gripped his shoulder heavier than necessary. Rachel's tone grew sharper beneath the sweetness. "Some things can't wait," she insisted. But he only nodded, gentle and weary. "Family isn't going anywhere?" He saw it then. The panic behind their eyes, the calculation unraveling as the performance faltered. He hugged Sophie once more before leaving her arms tightening around his neck as if she knew this embrace carried weight beyond birthdays. Whispering into her ear, he said softly, "Everything will be okay. I promise." She nodded, her eyes brighter with trust than with fear. Walking out into the cool night, he felt the air fill his lungs differently, sharper, alive with purpose. The charade was over. He slid behind the wheel of his car, the engine humming low, and sat in their driveway for a long moment. Behind him, the house that had once been a place of family warmth now glowed like a stage set, its players scrambling for a script they no longer controlled. He watched the front window where Michael and Rachel stood, their silhouettes locked in urgent conversation. He shifted the car into gear and drove away, headlights cutting through the darkness. His chest ached with betrayal, but his mind burned with clarity. They had planned to strip him of his independence, to cage him with papers and signatures. But thanks to Sophie, he now knew every move they intended to make. By the time he pulled into his own driveway, the plan had already begun to form. Tomorrow they would expect weakness. Tomorrow they would expect confusion. Tomorrow they would learn that the man they mistook for frail had been preparing his entire life for moments like this. And as he shut off the engine, a grim smile touched his lips. The stage was set, but the ending would not be theirs to write. He stepped back into the living room, carrying with him the weight of Sophie's whispered truth, but no one could see it. His expression was softened into the kind of weary smile that guests expected from a widowed father trying to enjoy his granddaughter's birthday. Rachel floated towards him almost immediately, her face painted with hospitality, a glass of wine already in her hand. "Here, Norman," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp beneath the surface. He accepted the glass with a nod, raising it just enough to acknowledge her effort before taking the smallest sip. To anyone watching, he was simply a tired man, enjoying the party, chuckling softly when prompted, murmuring pleasantries to neighbors, commenting on the decorations as if nothing had shifted in the world. But behind the polite facade, his eyes tracked everything. He saw the flash of Rachel's eyes cutting toward Michael whenever he drifted too close to financial conversations. He noticed how Michael, overcompensating with cheer, steered discussions away from mortgages, retirement, or property, corralling the chatter back to softball games or school recitals. It was subtle, but not subtle enough for him. Years in business had trained him to read men in boardrooms, and he could see the choreography of manipulation as clearly as a blueprint. He let the charade play out. When Rachel asked about his comfort, he praised the food. When Michael introduced him to guests as the man who taught me everything about trust and loyalty, he smiled, though inside the words curdled. Each phrase sounded like a shield, a performance for an audience unaware that beneath the laughter, a family war was preparing to ignite. The father leaned back on the couch, wine glass balanced between his fingers, and cataloged the details like evidence. Michael checked his watch again, too often for a man enjoying his daughter's party. Rachel leaned in close to whisper, their eyes locking in quick, coded exchanges. Guests probably thought it was the casual communication of a couple, but he saw the urgency underneath, the coordination of conspirators keeping their scheme on track. He noted it all, the rhythm of their smiles, the cracks in their voices, the way their cheer faltered whenever Sophie lingered near him for too long. Sophie's presence became his anchor. She darted through the room with her new Lego set tucked under her arm, her laughter brighter than the rest, though he recognized the courage beneath it. Every so often she would glance at him, her eyes carrying the weight of the secret she'd entrusted to him. Those glances fueled his composure. If she could be brave enough to whisper the truth, he could be strong enough to carry the mask. The evening moved forward with mechanical precision. Cake was served, candles blown out, children smeared frosting on their cheeks while parents clapped and cheered. Rachel orchestrated it all, her voice a steady current guiding the event along, but he noticed her gaze never strayed far from him. It wasn't the gaze of a caring daughter-in-law. It was the watchfulness of someone guarding an investment. He accepted another slice of cake, another round of chatter with guests, never once letting the storm inside slip through the cracks of his performance. His mind replayed Sophie's words with every bite, every sip, every laugh that wasn't truly his. They planned to take your money tonight. The phrase beat in rhythm with his pulse, and so he played the role they expected, the aging father softened by years, dulled by grief, content to let others direct the flow of his evening. It was a role he wore well, though beneath it burned something far sharper. As the sun dropped, lower shadows stretched across the house. The party began to thin. Guests gathered, coats, offered goodbyes, thanked Rachel for her generous hospitality. Michael's laughter grew thinner, more brittle as the crowd disappeared. He watched his son's eyes sharpen, urgency creeping into his performance, as if he could barely contain his anticipation for what came next. Rachel moved closer, her smile fixed but her jaw tight. Together they hovered near him, guiding him subtly toward the endgame. The father leaned into the role, letting his shoulders sag, letting his breath carry the faint heaviness of age. He chuckled politely when Rachel complimented his tie. He let Michael steer him toward the quiet of the kitchen, and he made no protest when they suggested in too casual tones that he stay just a little longer after the guests were gone. "We've been looking forward to that family talk," Michael said, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of false enthusiasm. The father nodded, hiding his thoughts behind a tired smile, his voice soft. "Of course, son. I wouldn't want to disappoint." But inside he was counting each beat of their performance, storing every word, every glance, every slip. He wasn't just observing them, he was dismantling their scheme piece by piece, the way a builder tests a structure before tearing it down. He lifted the last of his wine to his lips, holding their eyes over the rim of the glass. They thought he was theirs to manage, to corral, to bend into the frailty of their narrative. But beneath the mask his mind sharpened like a blade. Sophie's warning echoed through him, blending with Ellen's final words. "Watch him carefully." He was watching now, more carefully than ever, and he saw everything. The last guest closed the door behind them. The house grew quieter, the staged laughter replaced by a heavy, waiting silence. Michael shifted closer, Rachel's hand brushing his father's arm with rehearsed tenderness. "Just an hour, Norman," she said sweetly. "We've prepared something special for you." He smiled faintly, his eyes steady. The mask held, but behind it the storm gathered its full force. Tonight they believed he would sign away his life. Tonight they would discover just how wrong they were. The last voices faded as the door closed behind the final guest, leaving the house heavy with silence. Streamers sagged in the corners. Balloons drifted across the floor and the smell of frosting lingered in the air. Michael lingered near the kitchen doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes darting toward Rachel as if seeking her silent cue. Then he turned his voice, pitched too casually to be anything but rehearsed. "Dad, why don't you stay an hour? We need to talk about financial matters." The father straightened his jacket, his features softening into the practiced look of an aging man weary from the day. He pressed a hand to his temple as if nursing a headache, his smile faint. "Another time, son. I think I should head home and get some rest." The mask slipped on Michael's face only for an instant, but it was enough. The forced enthusiasm drained, replaced by a flash of desperation before he covered it with a strained grin. "But Dad, it won't take long," he said, stepping closer, his tone sharpened by urgency. Rachel appeared instantly, sliding into the space beside him, her hand brushing against his father's sleeve, her smile sweet, but her eyes sharp. "Norman, please. We've prepared something for weeks now, just a short conversation." He let his gaze drift between them, measuring the cracks in their performance. Michael's shoulders tightened, Rachel's eyes glimmered with a hunger she couldn't disguise. He let a tired sigh escape, the kind that made his back curve, the kind that said age was finally catching up. "Tomorrow," he said softly. "Family isn't going anywhere." The words hit harder than he expected. Michael's jaw clenched, his hand flexed as though restraining himself from grabbing his father's arm. "Dad, some of these matters can't wait. They're time-sensitive." That phrase echoed in his ears, a businessman's euphemism for desperation. He nodded faintly, giving them nothing but a ghost of a smile. All the more reason to discuss them with a clear head. Rachel's composure cracked just slightly, the edges of her smile quivering before she masked it again. He turned before they could press further, bending to kiss Sophie's forehead where she stood clutching her Lego box, her wide eyes locked on him. "Thank you for the most wonderful birthday, sweetheart," he whispered. Her arms tightened around his neck as though she knew this might be their last innocent embrace. "I love you, Grandpa," she said, her voice muffled against his collar. He squeezed her gently, his voice steady. "I love you too, more than you'll ever know." As he stepped out into the night, he felt Michael's hand on his shoulder, too heavy, almost restraining. But he brushed it off with the polite firmness of a man who had made up his mind. He walked down the path slowly, deliberately, while behind him he could hear the faint murmur of Rachel's voice hissing in Michael's ear. Their silhouettes lingered in the window as he reached his car, urgency etched in every line of their bodies. He slid behind the wheel, closed the door, and let the silence wrap around him like armor. The drive home was short, but every mile deepened the ache in his chest. His heart ached, not just from betrayal, but from recognition. The man standing in that kitchen was not the boy he had raised, the boy he once taught to fish, to swing a hammer, to tell the truth even when it burned. No, this was a man hollowed out by greed, bent beneath the weight of his wife's ambition, desperate enough to strip his father of dignity for the promise of wealth. Headlights carved the road ahead as his thoughts hardened. This was no longer about money. This was about survival, about refusing to be erased by the people who bore his name. Ellen's words echoed in his memory. Watch Michael carefully. Weak people make dangerous choices when someone strong is whispering in their ear. She had seen it long before him. Now he carried the burden of her warning sharper than ever as he pulled into his driveway and shut off the engine. Inside the house greeted him with silence. He walked straight to his study, his steps firm now. The weariness from the party cast aside. He opened the safe, the steel door heavy but familiar under his hands, and pulled out the folders he had left waiting. He spread them across his desk, the documents glowing pale under the lamplight. Investment statements, property deeds, bank records, evidence of a lifetime's work, evidence of the fortune they thought they could seize with a few signatures. He lowered himself into the chair, steepling his fingers, and began to plan. Tonight, Michael and Rachel believed he had walked away confused, too fatigued to resist. Tomorrow they would believe he was ready to hand over control. But he knew better. He knew the steps they would take, the tactics they would use, the legal trap they had built. And he knew how to dismantle it. He scribbled notes on a yellow pad, his handwriting sharp, precise. He listed every payment he had made, every sacrifice disguised as help. He marked names of allies, an old banker who still owed him favors, a notary who had stood beside him through years of contracts, an attorney known for discretion. He arranged them on the page like chess pieces, building a strategy with the patience of a man who had built houses from bare earth and steel. When the clock struck midnight, he pushed back from the desk and walked to the window. The night lay quiet, but his mind burned with clarity. The trap had been laid, but not for him. Tomorrow, when Michael and Rachel believed they were cornering him, they would discover they had stepped into something far more dangerous. He closed the curtains, his reflection staring back for a moment in the glass. The man in that reflection was older, yes, but not broken. He was a man sharpened by betrayal, strengthened by resolve, and armed with the truth whispered by a child who loved him more than her parents ever could. Tomorrow would come quickly, but he would be ready. And when the curtain finally dropped on their performance, it would not be the frail father who stood exposed. It would be the greedy son and the calculating wife revealed for what they truly were. The safe groaned as the lock released a sound that had always reassured him, but tonight it carried new weight. He pulled the heavy door open and reached for the thick binders and folders inside his hands, steady despite the storm in his chest. Papers rustled under his fingers, the history of a lifetime laid out in black and white. He spread them across his desk in neat rows, the lamplight catching the sharp edges of documents that told the story of sacrifice, grit, and years of choices made with Ellen by his side. $2.3 million in liquid assets, 3 rental homes, each generating steady income, a stack of meticulously recorded transactions that stretched back decades. Every check written, every loan forgiven, every dollar accounted for. They thought he was vulnerable. They thought he was weak. But what they saw as frailty was a mask, and tonight he was sharpening the blade beneath it. He settled into the leather chair, the one that had molded to his shape over years of late nights and hard decisions. His pen hovered over a yellow legal pad, the ink carving out names and numbers with surgical precision. Robert's name came first. Robert the banker, who had handled his accounts since the early days of his construction business, a man who knew how to move money quietly when necessary, who owed more than one favor for contracts steered his way decades ago. Then Linda, steady, discreet, a notary who had sat at his dining table countless times watching Ellen sign documents, her presence unassuming but ironclad. These were not acquaintances. These were allies, people who understood loyalty not as a word but as a debt. He picked up the phone and dialed Robert first. The voice on the other end was cautious but warm, the voice of a man pulled from sleep but ready to act when called. Robert, I need everything shifted by tomorrow morning. Every account, every cent. Consolidate what you can. I want nothing exposed. The pause was brief. Understood, Robert said, his tone sharpened, now the weight of the request clear. I'll make the calls before sunrise. You'll be protected. Next came Linda. She answered on the second ring, her voice steady, no hint of surprise. Norman, she said. What do you need? Signed, he explained in clipped sentences, each word deliberate. Protective trusts, revised beneficiaries, ironclad notarization that would make any sudden signatures attempted against him null. She didn't ask why, didn't press. She simply agreed. Have the documents ready by 9. I'll be there. When he hung up, the silence returned, but it wasn't the heavy silence of defeat. It was the charged quiet of strategy. He stacked the papers again, sliding them back into the safe with care, but not before pulling out a slim black folder Ellen had insisted they keep apart. Inside were copies of life insurance policies, investments. Michael and Rachel didn't even know existed, and letters Ellen had written in her final year. One in particular caught his eye. Her handwriting firm, even as illness pressed her down, carried across the page. If you're reading this, they'll already be circling. Don't play their game. Write your own rules. He sat back, staring at the words, the corner of his mouth twitching into something between grief and resolve. Ellen had seen the truth long before him. He had dismissed it as paranoia blinded by love for his son, but now her foresight was undeniable. She had left him more than money. She had left him a weapon. Midnight crept closer, the digital clock glowing red on the edge of his desk. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the bitter scent filling the house, and spread a city map across the desk. He marked the addresses of his rental properties, calculating which could be liquidated fastest, which could be shielded under trusts before Michael or Rachel even realized they existed. He circled names of tenants he trusted, people who had lived in his properties for years, families who had never missed rent. He would protect them too. As the hours slipped by, he rehearsed tomorrow in his mind like a general walking through a battle plan. He pictured Michael's false smile, Rachel's polished charm. He imagined the papers they would slide across the table, expecting his shaky hand to sign away his life. And then he imagined the look on their faces when they discovered the accounts empty, the assets moved, the power of attorney locked behind walls of notarized defense. He could almost see Rachel's composure crack, Michael's voice stutter. The thought carried a grim satisfaction, though the ache of betrayal remained sharp. By 2 a.m, his notes filled pages. Bullet points of defenses, contingencies, even the order of phone calls he would make before leaving the house at dawn. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but sleep was a luxury he could no longer afford. He poured another cup of coffee and turned back to Ellen's letter. The words a reminder of the woman who had seen through the fog of family illusion. "You've built your life on foundations," she had written once. "Remember, you know how to undermine them too." He rose, crossing to the window. Outside, the street was silent, every house dark but his. He could see his reflection faintly in the glass, older, yes, but sharpened now, carved into something harder than his son had ever known. He thought of Sophie asleep in her room across town, clutching her Lego box, carrying the weight of a secret she never should have borne. He thought of Michael pacing with Rachel, plotting the final act of betrayal they believed would succeed in the morning. And he thought of Ellen, her voice steady in memory, reminding him that weakness only existed if he allowed it. He turned back to the desk, sliding the last papers into a leather briefcase, snapping the lock shut. The preparations were complete. His allies were in place, his defenses ready. Tomorrow Michael and Rachel would step into the moment they believed was their triumph. But it would not be their victory. It would be their unveiling. He switched off the lamp, leaving the study in darkness. As he climbed the stairs, each step measured, he felt the house around him breathe with quiet strength. He had spent his life building brick by brick, foundation by foundation. Tomorrow he would show them he knew just as well how to dismantle. And as he reached the top of the stairs, one thought crystallized above all others. They would learn that betrayal had consequences, and those consequences would begin at dawn. The house was still the kind of silence that could either soothe or suffocate, depending on what filled a man's heart. He sat alone at his desk, the lamplight spilling across stacks of documents, but his eyes weren't on the numbers anymore. They drifted toward the refrigerator in the corner of the kitchen, where Sophie's crayon drawing was pinned by a chipped lighthouse magnet. A crooked house, 4 stick figures with wide smiles, her careful handwriting spelling out, "Best day ever." The simplicity of it made his chest tighten. That child still believed in family, still believed in him, even as the people who should have protected her the most plotted behind her back. The fire in him burned hotter than the bitterness. Betrayal carved deep, yes, but something sharper had risen from the wound resolve. His son thought of him as a frail old man, softened by age, dulled by grief, easy to shepherd toward a signature that would leave him hollow. Rachel thought of him as prey, the final obstacle between her and a fortune she had not earned. But tomorrow they would see the man he had always been. Tomorrow he would stop playing the role of victim and show them the architect of their undoing. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm of his own breathing steady him. He remembered the years when he built his company from the ground up, rising before dawn, working until his hands bled, learning that survival depended not on brute force, but on foresight. You built the foundation first, invisible but essential, and only then raised the walls. That same knowledge guided him now. His foundation was secure. His assets locked, his allies alerted, his plan set. What came next would be the walls collapsing, not his, but theirs. The clock read 2:30 in the morning when he rose and poured himself another coffee, strong and bitter. He didn't feel tired, not in the way he had earlier at the party when he feigned fatigue to escape their trap. No, tonight he felt sharper, younger, even as if betrayal had stripped away years of weariness. His mind worked with the precision of a blade, slicing through every possibility, every angle they might try. He rehearsed how they would corner him, how Rachel's voice would be sweet but urgent, how Michael's eyes would avoid his while pushing papers across the table. He rehearsed how he would respond, measured, calm, unshaken. But beyond strategy there was something else, something heavier that anchored his resolve. Sophie. Her whisper still rang in his ears, fragile but brave. "They plan to take your money tonight, Grandpa." She had risked her mother's wrath, her father's disappointment, just to give him a chance to fight back. No child should have to bear that burden. Tomorrow was not just about saving himself. It was about saving her from the poison growing in her own home. He set his coffee down and pulled open a drawer, retrieving a small wooden box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were keepsakes Ellen had saved, letters, photographs, a faded Valentine's card he had written her when they were still young. At the very bottom lay her wedding ring, the one she had slipped off when her fingers grew too thin near the end. He held it in his palm, the metal, cool, the weight small, but immense with meaning. "I'll take care of her, Ellen," he whispered. "I'll take care of Sophie. I won't let them take what we built." When dawn broke, pale light cut through the blinds, washing over the stacks of papers on his desk. He had not slept, but he didn't need to. Sleep was for men who could afford peace, and peace was not his luxury tonight. He showered, dressed in a pressed shirt and the same steel gray suit he had worn to board meetings in his prime. He studied his reflection in the mirror, straightening his tie, noting the lines carved deeper into his face, but also the steadiness in his eyes. Weak, confused. No. He looked like a man ready for war. He returned to the kitchen, taking one last look at Sophie's drawing. He slid it from the refrigerator and tucked it into his briefcase alongside the folders Robert and Linda would finalize that morning. A shield and a weapon all in one. He let his hand rest on the leather for a moment, feeling the hum of anticipation rise within him. The phone buzzed before 7. Michael's number lit the screen, followed by a text. "Don't forget, Dad. We'll be waiting after breakfast." He stared at it for a long moment, a bitter smile curling at the edge of his mouth. They thought they had written the script, thought they were the directors of his final act. But what they didn't know was that the ending had already changed, and he was the one holding the pen. He pocketed the phone, grabbed his keys, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The neighborhood was waking, sprinklers hissing on lawns, dogs barking in the distance, but to him it all felt different, sharper, heavier. Today was not just another day. Today was the reckoning. He climbed into his car, the leather seat familiar beneath him, the engine roaring to life. As he backed out of the driveway, his eyes flicked to the house one last time. It looked ordinary, quiet, unchanged. But inside those walls were memories of Ellen, years of laughter and struggle, the foundation of everything they had built together. He carried that with him now, every brick, every promise, every sacrifice. And he carried Sophie's trust, fragile and bright like a lantern guiding him through the darkness. The road stretched out ahead, and as the morning sun rose higher, so did his resolve. His son thought this would be the day they claimed victory, the day they stripped him of control. But this day would belong to him. This day would expose their greed, their weakness, their betrayal. And as the miles slipped away, he felt the steel of his conviction harden. He was not walking into a trap. He was walking into a battlefield he had already mapped, armed with every weapon they underestimated. Tomorrow had arrived, and with it their downfall. Life has a way of testing the bonds we hold most sacred. This story reminds us that trust once given blindly can be turned into a weapon by those driven by greed. For older Americans who have spent decades building homes, raising families, and sacrificing for the next generation, the lesson is clear. Generosity must be balanced with wisdom. Protecting what you've worked for isn't selfish. It's survival. Safeguarding your financial independence ensures that your dignity and choices remain yours, no matter who tries to interfere. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that love for grandchildren and future generations often becomes the compass that guides us through betrayal. Strength doesn't vanish with age. Sometimes it sharpens, forged by years of endurance. To every senior watching, remember, you are not weak, you are seasoned. Guard your legacy, trust your instincts, and never underestimate your ability to write the ending on your own terms. If this story struck a chord with you, don't just scroll away. Subscribe now for more powerful tales that will remind you of your strength, your wisdom, and the justice every parent deserves.